Eleanor Blackwood stood trembling on the auction block as strange men bid for ownership of her body and soul. Her father's grave still fresh when they seized her for his alleged debts. As the gavel prepared to fall, a dust-covered mountain man with haunted eyes stepped forward and spent his last dollar to claim her, a stranger whose scarred hands now held her fate. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Under the harsh glare of the midday sun, Thornfield's main street bustled with unusual activity. Market day always drew crowds, but today's spectacle had pulled in folks from 3 counties over. The auction block, normally reserved for cattle and horses, had been dragged to the center of town, its weathered wood stained with stories no decent person would repeat. Eleanor Blackwood stood upon it now, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her pale skin. Her once fine dress hung in tatters around her thin frame, the fabric caked with dust from the long journey that had brought her here. Dark hair fell in tangled waves past her shoulders, partially obscuring a face that might have been beautiful if not for the bruise blooming across her left cheek and the vacant desperation in her eyes. "Next up, gentlemen," the auctioneer called, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. A fine specimen from back east, young, strong, educated too, can read and write better than most men here. This earned a few chuckles from the audience. A starting bid at $20. The crowd shifted, eyes raking over Eleanor as if she were nothing more than livestock. She kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to acknowledge the hungry stares. 3 weeks ago, she had been the daughter of a respected physician in Boston. Now, after her father's sudden death and the discovery of his overwhelming debts, she had been seized as property and transported west to settle what he owed. "25, called a voice from the back. 30, countered another. Eleanor swallowed hard, fighting back the bile rising in her throat. The night before, locked in the sheriff's cell, she had overheard enough to understand what fate awaited her. The mining camp up north or the brothel on the edge of town, neither promised anything but misery and a swift end. "A $40, shouted a large man near the front, his beard streaked with tobacco stains. Eleanor recognized him as the owner of the Silver Bell Saloon, infamous for how quickly his girls seemed to age and disappear. 50, countered a sharp-faced man in a foreman's coat, Blackwell Mining Company's notorious overseer. The bidding continued, the price climbing as the 2 main contenders battled for possession. Eleanor's hands trembled, but she forced her expression to remain impassive. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not yet. $100, the saloon owner called, silencing the crowd. The sum was extravagant for such an auction, and a murmur rippled through the onlookers. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with greed. $100 going once, $101. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, quiet but firm. The sea of bodies parted, revealing a tall figure who seemed out of place among the townspeople. Dust clung to his long coat, and his broad-brimmed hat shadowed most of his face. A leather pack hung from one shoulder, and his stance suggested a man accustomed to hard travel and solitude. For the first time, Eleanor's composure faltered as she stared at the newcomer. There was nothing predatory in his posture, nothing that matched the hungry looks of the other bidders. Instead, she found herself meeting a gaze that held something far more dangerous than lust or ownership. It held recognition, as if he saw her not as merchandise, but as human. "Well now," the auctioneer recovered quickly, "seems we have a new player. 101 from the gentleman in the back. Going once. 110. The saloon owner growled, turning to glare at the interloper. The stranger stepped forward, moving through the crowd with unhurried confidence. When he reached the front, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Without speaking, he emptied its contents into his palm, a collection of coins and crumpled bills, everything he possessed. $137, he said simply. And 83 cents. The crowd fell silent. It was clear from the stranger's weathered appearance that he had just placed every cent he owned on the bidding block. The saloon owner hesitated, calculating whether the investment was worth exceeding such a sum. After a moment, he spat on the ground and stepped back. "Lucy ain't worth more than that anyway." "Sold!" the auctioneer proclaimed, bringing down his gavel with finality. "To the mountain man for $137.83. Eleanor's legs threatened to buckle beneath her as the stranger approached the auction block. Up close, she could see the details hidden by distance, the flecks of grey in his dark beard, the web of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting against mountain sun, and most surprisingly, the gentleness in his weathered hands as he offered them to help her down. "Name's Gabriel Hayes," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Archie, and I mean you no harm, Miss Blackwood." She hesitated, suspicion warring with desperate hope. "How do you know my name?" A shadow of something, grief perhaps, crossed his face. "I knew your father, and I've come a long way to keep a promise." Before she could question him further, the sheriff approached with the bill of sale. Gabriel signed the paper and handed over the pouch of money, which the sheriff counted twice before nodding with satisfaction. "She's your property now," the sheriff said, cutting the rope that bound Eleanor's wrists. "Do what you will." Gabriel's jaw tightened at the words, but he said nothing as he gently guided Eleanor away from the auction block. The crowd parted before them, some watching with curiosity, others with disappointment that the entertainment had concluded. "My horse is at the edge of town," Gabriel said quietly as they walked. "Can you ride?" Eleanor nodded, suddenly acutely aware of how vulnerable she was. She had just been purchased by a stranger who claimed to know her father, a father who, she was beginning to suspect, had kept many secrets from his only daughter. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you spend everything you have on someone you don't know?" Gabriel stopped walking and turned to face her. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with his answer, as if weighing how much truth to offer. "Because 20 years ago, your father saved my life," he finally said. "And because no person should be sold like cattle, no matter what debts they carry." There was more to it. Eleanor could see it in the way he averted his eyes after speaking, but for now, it was enough. As they reached the edge of town where a sturdy mare waited patiently, Eleanor made a silent vow that she would discover the full truth of this mountain man and the promise that had brought him to her rescue. Gabriel helped her mount before swinging up behind her. As the horse carried them away from Thornfield, Eleanor felt the town's eyes on her back. She had been sold to the highest bidder, but somehow, against all odds, she might have found salvation instead of damnation. The mountain man's presence at her back was solid and steady, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the faintest flicker of hope. The path ahead led toward the mountains that had captured her gaze during the auction. Wild, forbidding, and beautiful, much like the man who had just spent his last dollar to save her. Dust billowed behind them as Gabriel urged the mare into a steady canter once they were safely beyond the town's borders. Eleanor clutched the saddle horn, acutely aware of the stranger at her back, close enough that she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, yet careful to maintain what little propriety their situation allowed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail as they followed a winding path toward the foothills. Neither spoke for the first hour, both lost in the gravity of what had transpired. Eleanor's mind raced with questions, but exhaustion and hunger had worn her resolve to a threadbare state. When Gabriel finally broke the silence, his voice rumbled low against her back. "There's a creek about a mile ahead. We'll stop there, rest the horse, and you can wash up if you'd like." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. The simple kindness of his offer, the acknowledgement of her dignity after weeks of degradation, threatened to unravel the tight control she maintained over her emotion. The creek, when they reached it, gurgled pleasantly over smooth stones. Tall cottonwoods provided shade and a natural windbreak. Gabriel dismounted first, then reached up to help Eleanor down. Her legs buckled slightly as her feet touched earth, muscles protesting after the long ride. "And easy now." Gabriel steadied her with strong hands, then quickly stepped back once she found her balance. "Been a hard day, a hard month," Eleanor corrected, the words escaping before she could stop them. Gabriel nodded solemnly. "I reckon so." He busied himself with the horse, removing the saddle and rubbing down the animal's sweaty flanks before leading it to drink. "There's soap in my pack," he said, gesturing to the leather saddlebag. "And a clean shirt, if you want it. Not much, but it's something." Eleanor hesitated, then moved toward the pack. Inside, she found a small cake of lye soap wrapped in waxed paper, and a neatly folded flannel shirt that would hang like a dress on her frame. She glanced up at Gabriel, who had deliberately positioned himself with his back to her, focused on the horse. "I'll keep watch up on that ridge," he said, pointing to a rocky outcropping that overlooked the creek. "Take your time. You're safe here." The weight of those 3 words, "you're safe here," nearly undid her. She waited until his figure disappeared over the ridge before making her way to the creek's edge. The water ran cold and clear, a shocking relief against her skin as she scrubbed away weeks of travel grime and the lingering sensation of strangers' evaluating gazes. As she bathed, Eleanor catalogued her situation with the methodical precision her father had taught her. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she didn't know, heading toward an uncertain destination. She had no money, no possessions beyond the ruined dress she'd arrived in, and according to the laws of this territory, she was now this man's legal property. Yet something in Gabriel's manner suggested he viewed the bill of sale as an odious necessity rather than a right to ownership. He had treated her with careful respect, a far cry from what would have awaited her with either of the other bidders. After washing, Eleanor changed into the offered shirt, using a length of twine from the pack to cinch the voluminous fabric around her waist. She spread her tattered dress on sun-warmed rocks to dry, unsure if it could be salvaged, but unwilling to discard her last connection to her former life. When Gabriel returned from his watch, he carried a pair of rabbits already dressed for cooking. "Hope you're not opposed to rabbit," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "Not much else out here this time of year. I'm grateful for anything," Eleanor replied honestly. Her last meal had been a crust of bread tossed into her cell the previous evening. They worked in companionable silence, Gabriel building a small, nearly smokeless fire, while Eleanor skewered the rabbit meat on green branches he'd cut. As the meat sizzled over the flames, Eleanor gathered her courage. "You said you knew my father," she began. Gabriel nodded, his focus on the cooking meat. "I did, yet he never mentioned you." She kept her tone neutral, factual rather than accusatory. "I expect there were many things your father didn't mention." A muscle worked in Gabriel's jaw. "Edward Blackwood was a complicated man. He was a physician," Eleanor said, "respected in Boston society. Before Boston, he was an army surgeon out here," Gabriel replied, "during the Indian campaigns." Eleanor absorbed this information, rearranging her understanding of the man she'd thought she knew. "That's where you met him." Gabriel nodded, turning the meat to prevent burning. "I was a scout for the army, got separated from my unit during a blizzard. Your father found me half frozen in a ravine, brought me back when others would have left me for dead." "That sounds like him," Eleanor said softly. Despite his secrets, her father had been a healer to his core. "When I heard about his passing, I wrote to offer condolences." Gabriel's voice tightened. The letter came back with a note saying his property, including his daughter, was being sent west to settle debts. "I rode for 2 weeks straight to reach Thornfield before the auction." The implication hung in the air between them. He had come specifically for her, not by chance. "You spent everything you had," Eleanor said, "for a debt of honor to a dead man." Gabriel met her eyes then, his gaze steady and uncompromising. "No debt is paid by allowing an innocent to suffer. What happened today was wrong, Miss Blackwood. Plain and simple." "Eleanor," she corrected, "if we're to travel together, you might as well use my name." Something like surprise flickered across his weathered features, followed by a brief nod. "Eleanor." Then, as they ate the rabbit in the fading light, Eleanor gathered her courage for the question that had been pressing on her mind since they'd fled Thornfield. "Where are we going, Mr. Hayes?" "Gabriel," he countered, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "And we're heading to my cabin up in the high country. It's remote, but safe. No one will look for you there." "And after?" Eleanor pressed. "What becomes of me then?" Gabriel set down the bone he'd been cleaning and met her gaze directly. "That's for you to decide. I bought your freedom, Eleanor, not you. Once we're safely away, you can choose your own path. If you want to go to San Francisco or back east, I'll see you have what you need to make the journey." Eleanor studied him, searching for deception and finding none. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I know enough," he replied simply. I know you're Edward Blackwood's daughter. I know you didn't deserve what happened to you, and I know what it's like to have your life decided by others." He tossed the bones into the fire. "Everyone deserves a choice, Eleanor, even when the law says otherwise." As darkness settled around them, Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, processing his words. For the first time in weeks, someone was offering her agency over her own fate. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. "We should rest," Gabriel said, spreading his bedroll near the fire. "And it's another full day's ride to the foothills, and we'll want to be gone before first light." He offered her the bedroll while he took only his coat, setting himself up on the opposite side of the fire. As Eleanor settled into the rough blanket, she watched Gabriel through the dancing flames, this enigmatic mountain man who had spent his last dollar to save a stranger. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words inadequate for the debt she owed him. Gabriel nodded once, his profile sharp against the night sky. "Sleep now. We've got hard country ahead." As she drifted towards sleep, Eleanor realized that for all the uncertainty that lay before her, for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid. Dawn broke in thin ribbons of gold and pink across the eastern sky as Gabriel gently shook Eleanor awake. She startled at his touch, momentarily disoriented before the previous day's events rushed back. The auction block, the bids, the mountain man who had intervened. "We need to move," Gabriel said softly, already packing up their meager camp. "Sheriff in Thornfield has friends who patrol these lowlands." Eleanor nodded, rising quickly despite her aching muscles. She helped dismantle their small camp, folding the bedroll with practiced efficiency that earned a raised eyebrow from Gabriel. "Now, my father believed in practicality," she explained, noting his surprise. "Said a doctor's daughter should know how to make do in all circumstances." "Wise man," Gabriel replied, securing the pack to the saddle. "Though I reckon he didn't envision these particular circumstances." A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "No, I suppose not." They mounted as they had the day before, Eleanor in front with Gabriel behind, maintaining a respectful distance while still providing support should she falter. The mare set off at a brisk trot, heading toward the jagged mountains that loomed larger with each passing hour. As the sun climbed higher, the terrain grew increasingly difficult. The gentle slopes of the foothills gave way to steep switchbacks and narrow passes. Eleanor marveled at Gabriel's navigation skills. He guided them through seemingly impassable terrain with the confidence of someone who had traversed these paths countless times. "How long have you lived in these mountains?" she asked during a brief stop to rest the horse. Gabriel paused, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes before answering. "Going on 15 years now. Came west after the war. Never saw reason to leave." "The war?" Eleanor turned to study his face. He didn't look old enough to have fought in the war between the states. "I was young," he said, reading her thoughts. "Lied about my age. 17 when I joined up, barely 19 when it ended." He handed her the canteen. "Drink. The air gets thinner as we climb." Eleanor took a careful sip, rationing the water out of habit. "And you've been alone all this time?" Something flickered in Gabriel's eyes, a shadow of old pain quickly concealed. "Mostly. These mountains don't encourage company." By midday, they had climbed high enough that Eleanor could look back and see the vastness of the territory they'd crossed. The town of Thornfield was no longer visible, swallowed by distance and the undulating landscape. The thought brought equal measures of relief and disquiet. She was truly beyond the reach of civilization now, for better or worse. "There," Gabriel pointed toward a narrow gap between two towering rock formations. "Once we're through that pass, we'll be in my territory." "Your territory?" Eleanor echoed. "Figure of speech," he clarified, "but not many folks come this way. Too difficult for casual travelers. Too far from any mining claims to interest prospectors." As they approached the pass, Gabriel suddenly pulled the mare to a halt, his posture tensing. Eleanor felt the change immediately, the relaxed vigilance of their journey suddenly sharpening into alertness. "What is it?" she whispered, instinctively keeping her voice low. Gabriel didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the rocky outcroppings above the pass, searching. After a long moment, he relaxed slightly. "Thought I saw movement," he said. "Might have been a mountain lion. They den in these high rocks sometimes." Eleanor swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were in this wild place. "And are they dangerous?" Only if cornered or starving, Gabriel replied, urging the mare forward again, though Eleanor noticed he kept one hand close to the rifle strapped to the saddle. Most creatures prefer to avoid humans when they can. They passed through the narrow gap, single file, Gabriel leading the mare while Eleanor walked behind. The passage was cool and dark, the sun blocked by the towering rock walls. Their footsteps echoed softly, accompanied by the occasional skitter of loose stones. Once through, the landscape opened dramatically. A hidden valley spread before them, nestled between towering peaks. A crystal-clear stream cut through its center, flanked by stands of pine and aspen. On the far side, tucked against the protective curve of the mountain, stood a cabin. It was larger than Eleanor had expected, sturdy logs stacked and sealed with clay, a stone chimney rising from a peaked roof, a covered porch wrapped around two sides, and nearby stood a small barn and corral. It looked permanent, established, not the rough shelter of a transient mountain man, but the home of someone who had put down roots. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed, genuinely surprised. Gabriel's expression softened as he gazed at the cabin. "It serves its purpose." They descended into the valley, following a well-worn path that suggested years of use. As they drew closer, Eleanor noted other signs of permanent habitation: a vegetable garden enclosed by a stone wall, a woodpile stacked high against the coming winter, even a crude bench positioned to catch the afternoon sun. "You've built quite a life up here," she observed. Gabriel nodded. "A simple one." When they reached the cabin, Gabriel helped Eleanor dismount before seeing to the horse. "Go on inside," he offered, handing her a key from his pocket. "I'll tend to Sadie and bring in the supplies." Eleanor hesitated, the key heavy in her palm. "Are you certain? It's just a cabin," he said with a shrug, though something in his tone suggested it was anything but. "Door might stick. Hasn't been opened in a while." With tentative steps, Eleanor approached the cabin. The key turned easily in the lock despite Gabriel's warning, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. She stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. The interior was unexpectedly refined for such a remote dwelling. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. Sturdy furniture, a table with 4 chairs, a cushioned rocking chair, shelves lined with books, filled the main room. A curtained doorway presumably led to sleeping quarters. Everything was meticulously organized, from the cooking implements hanging near the fire to the stack of split kindling in the copper bucket. But what truly caught Eleanor's attention were the books. Dozens of them, their spines showing signs of frequent reading. Medical texts, history, philosophy, even poetry. These were not the possessions of a simple mountain hermit. As she ran her fingers along the spines, one title in particular made her pause: Surgical Practices in Field Conditions by Eleanor Blackwood, MD. Her father's book, published just before she was born. She pulled it from the shelf with trembling hands. Opening the cover revealed an inscription in her father's distinctive handwriting: "To Gabriel, who taught me more about courage than I taught him about medicine. May you find peace in your mountains, Edward." Eleanor was still staring at the inscription when Gabriel entered, carrying their packs. He stopped short when he saw the book in her hands, his expression unreadable. "Oh, you weren't just an acquaintance of my father's," Eleanor said softly, the pieces beginning to align. "You were his friend." Gabriel set down the packs and removed his hat, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that suddenly made him seem younger, less certain. "Yes," he admitted, "we were friends, after a fashion." "And this cabin?" Eleanor glanced around, understanding dawning. "He helped you build it, didn't he?" Gabriel moved to the fireplace, kneeling to arrange kindling for a fire. "He stayed here one summer, about 10 years back. Said he needed time away from Boston. We added the East Room then." His hands worked methodically, striking flint to steel. "Edward was a good man, despite his mistakes." "What mistakes?" Eleanor pressed, sensing she was finally approaching the truth that had been hovering just beyond her grasp since Gabriel had appeared at the auction. The kindling caught, flames licking upward. Gabriel remained kneeling, watching the fire grow before finally answering. "That's a conversation best had with food and warmth," he said, rising to his feet. "And the trail up here is demanding, and you need rest. There's a washroom behind that door, pump works, though the water's cold." East room is yours for as long as you stay. Eleanor recognized the deflection but decided not to press further. Gabriel was right. They were both exhausted, and whatever revelations awaited could wait a few more hours. "Thank you," she said simply, clutching her father's book to her chest. Gabriel nodded once, then turned toward the small kitchen area. "I'll get supper started. Might not be what you're used to from Boston, but it'll fill you." As Eleanor retreated to the offered room to wash away the trail dust, she couldn't shake the feeling that this cabin held more secrets than just her father's friendship with a mountain recluse. Secrets that might explain why Gabriel Hayes had traveled so far and spent his last dollar to save her. The east room was small but thoughtfully arranged. A narrow bed with a handmade quilt occupied one corner, a washstand with basin and pitcher another. A chest of drawers stood against the wall, its surface bare save for a small mirror. Eleanor's fingers traced the wood grain, noting the careful craftsmanship. Like everything in Gabriel's cabin, it spoke of patience and precision. After washing, Eleanor changed into clean clothes Gabriel had left outside her door, a simple cotton dress that hung loose on her frame but was infinitely preferable to her ruined garments. It struck her as odd that he would have women's clothing on hand, but she pushed the thought aside as she returned to the main room. Gabriel stood at the stove, stirring something that filled the cabin with a rich, savory aroma. He'd changed as well, his trail-worn clothes replaced with a clean shirt and trousers, though he still wore the same worn boots. He glanced up as she entered, his expression softening briefly before returning to its usual reserve. "Fits well enough," he commented, nodding at the dress. "Yes, thank you." Eleanor hesitated, then decided directness was best. "Though I'm curious why you have women's clothing." Gabriel's stirring slowed momentarily. "Some things get left behind," he said after a pause, his tone discouraging further inquiry. Eleanor took the hint and changed subjects. "Can I help with anything?" "Table could use setting," he replied, gesturing toward a cupboard. "Plates are there." They worked in companionable silence, Eleanor arranging the table while Gabriel finished preparing their meal, a hearty stew with biscuits baked in a Dutch oven nestled in the coals. When they finally sat to eat, Eleanor realized how ravenous she was. The stew was simple but delicious, chunks of venison and root vegetables in a rich broth. "This is wonderful," she said after her first few bites. "I didn't expect such culinary skill from—" She stopped herself, embarrassed. "From a mountain hermit," Gabriel supplied, amusement briefly lighting his eyes. "Living alone teaches a man to cook or starve." Eleanor smiled. "My father was the same way after my mother died. He said bad cooking was an affront to his medical sensibilities. Something about proper nutrition being the foundation of health." "Sounds like Edward," Gabriel agreed, breaking a biscuit in half. "He lectured me plenty on my deplorable dietary habits that summer he stayed here." The casual mention opened the door Eleanor had been waiting for. "But you promised to tell me about my father," she reminded him gently. "About the mistakes you mentioned." Gabriel's expression sobered. He finished his stew in silence, then pushed the bowl aside and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might refuse to answer, but then he sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "Your father came west in '66, fresh out of medical school," he began. "Army needed surgeons for the frontier posts. Edward was idealistic, wanted to bring modern medicine to the wilderness, as he put it." Gabriel rose. Retrieving a bottle and 2 glasses from a cabinet, he poured a finger of amber liquid into each, sliding one toward Eleanor. "He was assigned to Fort Richardson, where I was stationed as a scout," Gabriel continued, taking a small sip from his glass. "That's where we met. I'd been wounded in a skirmish with Comanche raiders, arrow through my shoulder. Your father removed it, kept the wound from festering." Eleanor listened intently, trying to reconcile this image of her father, young, idealistic, serving on the frontier, with the stern Boston physician she had known. "There was a young woman at the fort," Gabriel continued, his voice growing more measured. "Catherine Winters, daughter of the quartermaster. Beautiful, educated, spirited, too spirited for frontier life, according to most. Your father courted her, rather properly for such remote circumstances." Gabriel paused, his eyes distant. "That winter was harsh. Food ran short. Disease spread through the fort. Catherine fell ill with fever. Edward tended her day and night, trying every treatment he knew. Nothing worked." His voice had grown softer. "She died in February. Your father, he didn't handle it well." Eleanor stared into her untouched drink, He never mentioned any Catherine. No, he wouldn't have. Gabriel's fingers tightened around his glass. What happened after is what Edward considered his greatest mistake. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the silence that had fallen between them. Outside, wind whistled through the pines, a mournful counterpoint to Gabriel's tale. There was a Comanche raid that spring, he continued finally. Bad one. Several soldiers killed, others wounded. Among the wounded was a young brave, barely more than a boy. He'd been shot trying to escape. The commanding officer wanted him interrogated, then hanged as an example. Gabriel's expression darkened. Your father intervened, said his oath required him to treat the wounded, regardless of who they were. The colonel disagreed, forcefully. What happened? Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew. Edward smuggled the boy out of the fort, asked me to guide them to a Comanche camp where the boy could rejoin his people. Gabriel met her eyes directly. I agreed. We were both court-martialed for it. Eleanor's breath caught. My father was court-martialed, but that's hard to believe of the respectable Boston physician. Gabriel finished for her. The army was quiet about it. Edward had influential family back east. They arranged for charges to be reduced. Records sealed. He received a dishonorable discharge, but avoided prison. And you? Eleanor asked. Gabriel's smile held no humor. I had no influential family. 5 years at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. The revelation hung between them. Eleanor struggled to process this new information, this hidden chapter of her father's life that explained so much. His reluctance to discuss his early career, his occasional nightmares, his passionate insistence that she always stand by her principles, regardless of consequence. After his discharge, Edward went back east. Gabriel continued, started over in Boston, met your mother, built the respectable life you knew. We corresponded occasionally. He sent books, medical supplies, visited once. The summer we expanded the cabin. Eleanor's mind raced, connecting fragments of memory. The summer he said he was attending a medical conference in Colorado. She murmured. Mother had just died. He was gone for months. Gabriel nodded. He spoke of you often, proudly. If you served 5 years in prison because of him, why would you help me? Eleanor asked, voicing the question that had plagued her since learning of their connection. Surely you must have resented him. I made my own choice, Gabriel replied simply. Same as Edward. We both did what we thought was right, and we both paid prices for it. Difference was, he had something to go back to. He gestured vaguely at the cabin around them. And I found my place here instead. Eleanor considered this, sensing there was more Gabriel wasn't telling her, but uncertain how to press further. She took a small sip of her drink, the liquor burning a warm path down her throat. Last year, your father wrote to me, Gabriel said, finishing his own drink. Said he had a premonition he wouldn't live much longer. Asked me to look out for you if anything happened to him. A shadow crossed his face. I wrote back. Promised I would. Never expected it to mean buying you off an auction block. The brutal reminder of her recent circumstances made Eleanor flinch. Gabriel noticed and immediately looked regretful. I'm sorry, he said. That was indelicate, but accurate, Eleanor replied, straightening her shoulders. And I'd rather face truth than comforting lies. She studied him across the table. So what happens now? You fulfilled your promise to my father by rescuing me. What comes next? Gabriel considered her question carefully. That depends on you. As I said before, you're not my property, regardless of what that bill of sale says. Once you've rested, you can take Sadie and enough supplies to reach Denver. Start fresh there, or go back east if that's what you want. And if I don't know what I want? Eleanor asked quietly. Gabriel's expression softened slightly. Then you stay until you figure it out. This cabin has weathered plenty of uncertainty over the years. It can weather yours too. The offer, simple and straightforward, brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. After weeks of having her fate determined by others, by creditors, by the sheriff, by bidders at auction, the gift of choice was overwhelming. Thank you, she managed, quickly wiping away the moisture before it could fall. Gabriel nodded once, then rose to clear their dishes. Dawn comes early in the mountains. You should rest. As Eleanor retreated to the east room, she found herself wondering about the woman who had worn this dress before her, and about Catherine Winters, whose death had altered the course of her father's life, and by extension, her own. Somewhere in that history, she sensed, lay the full explanation for why Gabriel Hayes had ridden for 2 weeks and spent his last dollar to save a woman he'd never met. Eleanor woke to the sound of chopping wood. Sunlight streamed through the small window of the east room, casting dappled patterns across the quilt. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, the unfamiliar surroundings, the distant rhythm of axe-striking wood, the mountain quiet so different from Boston's constant bustle. Then, yesterday's revelations flooded back. She dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes, splashed cool water on her face from the basin, and made a cursory attempt to tame her hair before venturing outside. The morning air carried a crisp bite that hinted at the coming autumn. Frost sparkled on the grass in areas still shadowed from the sun. Gabriel stood by the woodpile, his back to her, as he methodically split logs with powerful sow practice strokes. He'd removed his shirt despite the cool air, and Eleanor found herself momentarily transfixed by the play of muscles across his shoulders and the lattice work of old scars that marked his skin, some thin and surgical, others jagged and violent in their telling. Sensing her presence, Gabriel paused mid-swing and turned. "Morning," he said simply, setting the axe aside and reaching for his shirt. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted, averting her eyes as he dressed. "The mountain air agrees with me, I think," Gabriel nodded, buttoning his shirt. "Coffee's hot inside. Or bread too, if you're hungry." "Thank you." Eleanor hesitated, then gestured to the substantial pile of split wood. "You've been busy." "Winter comes early up here," he explained, rolling his sleeves down, "and stays late. Can't have too much firewood." The practical concern struck Eleanor suddenly. How long did Gabriel expect her to stay? Would she still be here when winter gripped these mountains? The thought was both comforting and alarming. She had options, he'd assured her. But how viable were those options with snow blocking the passes? Gabriel seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't worry. I won't keep you here when the snows come." He picked up an armload of split logs. "Coffee's getting cold." Inside, Eleanor found the promised pot of coffee and a loaf of bread, still warm from baking, along with butter and preserves. Gabriel had been up for hours, apparently. She poured 2 cups as he entered with the firewood. "I thought I might explore a bit today," she said, as he stacked the logs beside the hearth. "If that's all right." Gabriel straightened, brushing dust from his hands. "Cabin fever already?" "Just curious," Eleanor clarified. "I've never been in mountains like these." He nodded, accepting the coffee she offered. "Stay within sight of the cabin for now. Mountains not forgiving of mistakes." His tone was matter-of-fact rather than condescending. "I need to check trap lines and hunt. We'll need meat for the coming days." After breakfast, Eleanor watched Gabriel prepare for his excursion, checking his rifle, packing supplies in a small knapsack, strapping a knife to his belt. His movements were efficient, practiced, containing no wasted motion. I'll be back before dusk," he said, shouldering his rifle. "Keep the door latched. Unlikely anyone would come up here, but better safe than sorry." After he departed, the cabin fell into profound silence. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching until Gabriel's figure disappeared among the trees. Then, taking a deep breath of the pine-scented air, she set out to explore her temporary sanctuary. The cabin itself deserved closer examination in daylight. Built of sturdy logs chinked with clay and moss, it was larger than it had first appeared. The wraparound porch offered views in 3 directions: east toward the rising sun, south across the valley, and west toward the looming peaks. A handmade bench positioned on the western side suggested Gabriel's preference for sunset views. The small barn housed not only the mare, Sadie, but also a milk cow, several chickens, and a store of hay and grain sufficient to last through winter. A workshop adjoined the barn, containing woodworking tools arranged with military precision. Half-finished pieces, a chair leg, what appeared to be a small table, suggested ongoing projects. Beyond the immediate clearing, Eleanor discovered a well-tended vegetable garden enclosed by a stone wall. Late-season squash, root vegetables, and hardy greens flourished despite the altitude. A small orchard of stunted apple trees, laden with ripening fruit, stood nearby. Gabriel had created not just a shelter, but a self-sufficient homestead hidden away in this mountain valley. As she circled back toward the cabin, Eleanor spotted something unexpected: a small fenced plot set apart from the garden. Within it stood a simple wooden cross, a grave. She approached slowly, uncertain whether she was intruding on something private. The cross bore no name, only a date carved into the wood. April 17, 1869. 7 years ago, Eleanor knelt beside the small plot, wondering who lay beneath. Catherine Winters had died at the fort, according to Gabriel's story. This was someone else. Someone Gabriel had brought to his mountain sanctuary. Someone who had died here. The absence of a name spoke volumes. Either the person had been a stranger, or the name had been so precious Gabriel couldn't bear to carve it. Lost in thought, Eleanor didn't immediately register the sound of approaching footsteps. When she did, she turned quickly, expecting Gabriel's return, but instead found herself facing a stranger. The man stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her with undisguised curiosity. Tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who lived outdoors, he carried a rifle casually in the crook of his arm. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and the horse behind him was well-bred. "Didn't expect to find a lady up here," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. Gabriel finally get himself hitched. Eleanor rose slowly, conscious of her vulnerability. Gabriel was miles away, and she was alone with this unknown man who spoke with familiar ease about her reluctant host. "Mr. Hayes is hunting," she replied cautiously, moving away from the grave toward the cabin. "He should return shortly." The man's eyebrows rose at her formal address. "Mr. Hayes, is it?" A smile quirked his lips. "Well, now, that's interesting." He took a step forward, then seemed to think better of it when Eleanor tensed. "Oh, no need for alarm, ma'am. Marcus Sullivan, old friend of Gabriel's." "I wasn't aware Mr. Hayes had friends," Eleanor replied, then immediately regretted the comment. Sullivan laughed, a genuine sound that echoed across the clearing. "Not many, to be sure. Mind if I water my horse? Been a long ride up from Durango." Eleanor hesitated. If the man truly knew Gabriel, refusing him basic hospitality seemed unnecessarily hostile. Yet Gabriel's warning to keep the door latched echoed in her mind. "The trough is by the barn," she said finally, gesturing. "I'm afraid I can't invite you inside until Mr. Hayes returns." Sullivan nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. Cautious. Good. Gabriel would approve. He led his horse toward the trough, maintaining a respectful distance from Eleanor. "Been with him long?" "That's rather a personal question, Mr. Sullivan." He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just making conversation. Gabriel's not exactly known for company, especially female company." He studied her with renewed interest. "You got a name?" "Eleanor Blackwood," she replied after a moment's consideration. Sullivan froze, his hand halfway to his canteen. "Blackwood? As in Dr. Blackwood?" The recognition in his voice confirmed his connection to Gabriel. "Oh, he was my father," Eleanor acknowledged. Sullivan let out a low whistle. "Well, that explains a few things." He took a drink from his canteen, watching her over the rim. "Gabriel mentioned you were in some trouble. Didn't say what kind." "I don't see how that's your concern," Eleanor replied stiffly. "It ain't," Sullivan agreed easily. "Just filling in the blanks. Gabriel rides off in a hurry 3 weeks back, saying something about a debt to settle. Returns with the daughter of Edward Blackwood." He shook his head. "Life sure takes some interesting turns." A twig snapped in the forest edge, and both Eleanor and Sullivan turned sharply. Gabriel emerged from the trees, a brace of rabbits slung over one shoulder, his expression darkening as he registered the visitor. "Sullivan," he said, his tone neutral but his posture alert. "Unexpected." "As always," Sullivan replied with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Was just introducing myself to Miss Blackwood here. Lovely lady. Didn't mention you had company up here." Gabriel moved to stand between Eleanor and Sullivan, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. What brings you up my mountain, Marcus?" Sullivan's casual demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more businesslike. "News you'll want to hear. Privately," he added with a glance toward Eleanor. Gabriel turned to her. "Would you mind giving us a moment?" Eleanor nodded, retreating to the cabin porch where she could observe but not hear the men's conversation. Whatever Sullivan said caused Gabriel's expression to harden, his jaw tightening visibly. The exchange was brief but intense, ending with a curt nod from Gabriel. "You'll stay the night?" Gabriel said, his voice carrying to where Eleanor waited. "But we're not discussing this further in front of her." Sullivan's gaze flicked to Eleanor, then back to Gabriel. Fair enough. He extended his hand, which Gabriel clasped briefly. Good to see you still breathing, brother. The familiar address caught Eleanor's attention. Not brother in the casual sense men sometimes used, but something more significant. A shared history, perhaps even a bond forged in combat or hardship. Gabriel returned to the porch, his expression guarded. Sullivan will be staying tonight, he informed her, his tone allowing no argument. He's trustworthy despite appearances. I gathered you have history, Eleanor replied carefully. We served together, Gabriel confirmed. Both in the army and after, in less official capacities. He hesitated, then added, he's the closest thing to family I have out here. The admission seemed to cost him something, as though acknowledging such connections was unfamiliar territory. Eleanor wondered what other revelations might emerge with Sullivan's unexpected arrival, and what news had brought him up the mountain to find Gabriel. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. Gabriel had prepared a hearty stew with the rabbits he'd caught, accompanied by biscuits and the last of the summer's preserved berries. Sullivan ate with the enthusiasm of a man long accustomed to trail rations, praising the food with genuine appreciation that seemed to irritate rather than please Gabriel. Still the best cook in the mountains, Sullivan remarked, sopping up stew with a biscuit. Remember that winter near Laramie? 4 feet of snow and nothing but jerky for weeks. Gabriel grunted non-committally, his attention seemingly focused on his plate, though Eleanor noticed his eyes constantly tracking Sullivan's movements. Miss Blackwood, Sullivan turned his charm toward her. Has Gabriel told you about our adventure? No. Modest as always. He leaned back in his chair, cradling a cup of coffee. We were quite the pair back in the day. The Army's best scouts. Until that unfortunate business with your father. Eleanor glanced at Gabriel, whose expression had hardened. I know about the court-martial, she said quietly. Sullivan nodded, unsurprised. Figured he'd have told you that much. What about after? Did he mention our time with Anderson's Rangers? That's enough, Marcus, Gabriel interrupted, his voice low but carrying unmistakable warning. Sullivan raised his hands in mock surrender. Just making conversation. The lady might be curious about the man who spent his last dollar to buy her freedom. The crude phrasing made Eleanor flinch. Gabriel noticed and pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping across the wooden floor. Miss Blackwood is tired, he said firmly. You and I have business to discuss. Eleanor recognized the dismissal, but bristled at being treated like a child. Actually, I'm not tired at all, she countered, meeting Gabriel's gaze directly. And I'd rather not be discussed as if I weren't present. Sullivan's bark of laughter broke the tension. She's got spirit, Gabriel. Just like her old man. He turned to Eleanor with unexpected sincerity. Your father was a good man, Miss Blackwood, one of the few who saw us as people, not just tools for the Army's work. You knew him as well? Eleanor asked, surprised. Not as well as Gabriel, Sullivan clarified, but enough to respect him. He patched me up more than once. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a jagged scar that ran from wrist to elbow. Mexican knife. Would have bled out if your father hadn't been there. Gabriel pushed a bottle toward Sullivan. If you're determined to tell stories, you might as well do it properly. He glanced at Eleanor. Unless you'd prefer to retire. Eleanor recognized the olive branch for what it was, Gabriel acknowledging her right to choose. I'd like to stay, she said. If Mr. Sullivan has stories about my father, I'd be grateful to hear them. Sullivan poured himself a generous measure, then offered the bottle to Eleanor, who declined with a small shake of her head. Your father wasn't like other Army doctors, he began, settling into his role as storyteller. Most of them viewed frontier posts as punishment, too far from civilization, too close to savages. They treated soldiers like inconveniences and natives like animals. He took a sip, his eyes growing distant with memory. Edward Blackwood was different, treated everyone the same. Officers, enlisted men, scouts, even prisoners. Said his oath didn't distinguish between worthy and unworthy suffering. That sounds like him, Eleanor said softly, remembering her father's insistence on treating patients from Boston's poorest neighborhoods alongside its wealthiest citizens. Got him in trouble more than once, Sullivan continued. Military hierarchy doesn't appreciate being leveled by medical ethics. He glanced at Gabriel. Right up until that final incident with the Comanche boy. Gabriel remained silent, staring into his untouched drink. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look older, wearier. What happened to the boy? Eleanor asked. The one my father helped escape. Sullivan's expression sobered. He made it back to his people, lived as far as we know. He looked at Gabriel. Though it cost others dearly. A weighted silence fell over the table. Eleanor sensed they had reached the boundaries of what Sullivan felt free to discuss without Gabriel's permission. She changed tactics. Mr. Sullivan, you mentioned Anderson's Rangers. What were they? Sullivan shot Gabriel a questioning look. When Gabriel gave a slight nod, Sullivan continued cautiously. After the war, the frontier was chaos. Army couldn't maintain order. Locals formed militias, some better than others. Anderson's Rangers were scouts and peacekeepers, officially sanctioned but loosely governed. Bounty hunters, Gabriel corrected flatly, paid to track down deserters, fugitives, and anyone else with a price on their head. Eleanor's eyes widened. And you both joined. After what happened with the court-martial? I did 5 years in Leavenworth, Gabriel reminded her. Not many options for an ex-convict with dishonorable discharge papers. Sullivan waited for me, said Anderson was always looking for men who could track and shoot. His voice held no emotion, as if reciting facts about someone else entirely. Sullivan's expression turned rueful. Wasn't our proudest chapter. But we had skill, and Anderson paid well. He glanced at Gabriel. Until Gabriel here developed a conscience and started asking too many questions about who we were hunting and why. Gabriel pushed back from the table and stood. Ancient history, he said dismissively. Sullivan, we need to discuss current business. Eleanor, if you'll excuse us. This time, Eleanor didn't protest. The glimpse into Gabriel's past had raised more questions than it answered, but his tense posture made it clear the conversation had reached its limit. She nodded and rose from the table. Of course. Thank you for sharing what you did, Mr. Sullivan. Sullivan inclined his head. My pleasure, Miss Blackwood. Perhaps tomorrow I can tell you how your guardian angel here earned his rather dramatic scars. Makes for quite the tale. Gabriel's withering look silenced Sullivan, who merely grinned in response. Eleanor retreated to the east room, closing the door behind her, but remaining close enough to hear the low murmur of voices from the main room. Though she couldn't distinguish words, the urgent tone was unmistakable. She moved to the small window, gazing out at the moonlit valley. Sullivan's unexpected arrival had shattered the fragile peace she'd begun to feel in this remote cabin. His casual references to Gabriel's past, Anderson's Rangers, hunting men for bounty, painted a very different picture than the solitary mountain man who had spent his last dollar to save her. How much of Gabriel's kindness toward her stemmed from genuine concern, and how much from obligation to her father? The question troubled her more than she cared to admit. A sudden rise in volume from the other room caught her attention. Sullivan's voice, no longer casual, but sharp, with warning. Looking for her specifically, Gabriel. This isn't just about the debt anymore. Gabriel's response was too low to hear, but Sullivan's reply came clearly enough. Sheriff sold the information. They know exactly who bought her and where you might have taken her. Eleanor's blood ran cold. They were discussing her, and apparently someone was hunting her. But why? What value could she possibly have beyond the debt that had already been settled by the auction? She pressed closer to the door, straining to hear more. 3 days at most before they reached the pass, Sullivan was saying. Do you need to move her? No, Gabriel's voice, firm and resolute. Winter's coming. Passes will close soon. She's safer here. Damn it, Gabriel. You're not listening. This isn't just about the mining company anymore. It's Prescott. He's obsessed. Says she belongs to him by rights. Prescott. The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Joe Prescott, the saloon owner who had bid against Gabriel at the auction. The man with tobacco-stained teeth and cold, calculating eyes. He can come if he wants, Gabriel replied, his voice deadly quiet. I've dealt with worse than Prescott. Not with Prescott and a dozen hired guns, Sullivan countered, and not with a woman to protect. Silence fell, heavy and ominous. Eleanor backed away from the door, her mind racing. She had become a liability to Gabriel, a man who had already sacrificed everything he had to save her from Prescott once. Now, the same threat was bearing down on them, multiplied many times over. She glanced around the small room that had briefly been her sanctuary. Her gaze fell on the dress she'd arrived in, now mended and cleaned, hanging from a peg on the wall. A decision crystallized in her mind, terrible but necessary. She would not be the cause of Gabriel's death. Whatever debt he owed her father, it did not extend to sacrificing his life. When morning came, she would take Sadie and enough supplies to reach the nearest town. She would disappear, leaving Gabriel to his mountain sanctuary and the peace he had carved out for himself. It was the only way to repay the man who had given his last dollar to save her. Dawn had barely begun to lighten the eastern sky when Eleanor slipped from the cabin. She had waited until the deep and even breathing from the main room assured her that both men were asleep before enacting her plan. Dressed in her mended clothes with the borrowed dress folded neatly on the bed, she carried only what she absolutely needed: a small bundle of food, a canteen of water, and a crude map Gabriel had sketched of the surrounding area that she'd found in one of his books. The morning air bit at her exposed skin as she made her way to the barn, moving as silently as possible across the frost-stiffened ground. Inside, Sadie nickered softly in recognition. Eleanor hushed her with gentle hands, quickly securing the saddle as she had watched Gabriel do. Every creak of leather seemed thunderous in the pre-dawn stillness. "I wouldn't," came a quiet voice from the shadows. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sullivan stepped forward, arms crossed over his chest, expression unreadable in the dim light. "Mr. Sullivan," she managed, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I was just running away," he finished for her. Noble but foolish. Eleanor's hands fell from the saddle straps. "You heard them. They're coming for me. Gabriel has done enough, risked enough. I won't be responsible for more." Sullivan studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Oh, you heard fragments of a conversation you didn't understand, and now you're making decisions that will get you killed." He moved forward, gently nudging her aside to loosen the saddle. "Gabriel would track you down before you made it 5 miles. And if he didn't, Prescott's men would. Either way, you've made his job harder." "His job?" Eleanor echoed, confusion momentarily overriding her determination. "I'm not his responsibility." Sullivan's laugh held no humor. "Lady, you became his responsibility the moment Edward Blackwood saved his life. Gabriel Hayes doesn't understand halfway measures." He secured Sadie's stall and gestured toward the barn door. "Come on. Sun's almost up and I smell coffee." Sure enough, as they approached the cabin, the scent of brewing coffee drifted through the early morning air. Gabriel stood on the porch, rifle cradled in one arm, mug in hand, his expression changing from vigilant to relief as he spotted them emerging from the barn. Eleanor felt a flash of shame at the concern evident in his posture. "Morning stroll?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sullivan snorted. "Found your houseguest saddling Sadie for a heroic sacrifice. Seems she overheard enough of our conversation to get dangerous ideas." Gabriel's eyes narrowed as they fixed on Eleanor. "Is that so?" Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed. "I heard enough to know that Prescott is coming with armed men. Because of me, I won't be the cause of more violence in your life." Gabriel set his mug down with deliberate care. "So you thought you'd ride out alone, through country you don't know, toward towns where Prescott has friends and influence?" The quiet control in his voice was more intimidating than anger would have been. "Did it occur to you that you'd be delivering yourself right back into his hands?" "Aye," Eleanor faltered, the flaw in her plan suddenly glaringly obvious. "Coffee's getting cold," Gabriel said, turning to enter the cabin. "We'll discuss this inside." Sullivan gave Eleanor a sympathetic glance as they followed Gabriel indoors. "He's not angry," he murmured. "He's scared. There's a difference." Inside, Gabriel poured coffee for all 3 of them, his movements precise and controlled. No one spoke until they were seated at the table, steam rising from their mugs in the cool morning air. You need to understand something," Gabriel finally said, looking directly at Eleanor. "Prescott isn't just after you because he lost the auction. This goes deeper." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm mug. Gabriel exchanged a glance with Sullivan, who nodded encouragingly. "Your father's debts," Gabriel began. "They weren't what you were told. Edward Blackwood wasn't a careless man with money." Eleanor frowned. "But the creditors were frauds." Sullivan interjected. Working for Prescott, who's a front for the Blackwell Mining Company. I don't understand, Eleanor said, looking between the two men. What would a mining company want with my father's estate? We had no holdings out west. Gabriel's expression darkened. Not your father's estate. You! He took a deep breath, clearly struggling with how to continue. When your father helped that Comanche boy escape, it wasn't just about saving an innocent life. The boy had witnessed something the army and their civilian partners wanted kept quiet. What kind of something? Eleanor pressed, sensing they were finally approaching the heart of the matter. Massacre, Sullivan said bluntly. Not a skirmish, not a battle. Blackwell Mining wanted Comanche land that had valuable copper deposits. Army officers were bribed to provoke an incident that would justify wiping out the camp. Your father treated survivors, heard their stories. The boy was the chief's son, the only witness they hadn't managed to silence. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. And my father knew this. Gabriel nodded grimly. He documented everything. Names, dates, coordinates. The kind of evidence that could bring down high-ranking officers and one of the largest mining operations in the territory. Those documents, Sullivan continued, were never found. Not during the court-martial, not in your father's effects after he returned east. Blackwell Mining assumed he'd hidden them as insurance. For 20 years, Gabriel added, they watched him, waiting for him to use the information or pass it on. When he died suddenly, they panicked. They fabricated debts to seize his property. And you, me? Eleanor whispered. But why? Because, Gabriel said softly, Edward told you stories, bedtime tales about his time out west. Stories a child might remember years later as an adult. Stories that might contain coded information. Eleanor's mind raced back through countless evenings by the fire, her father's deep voice spinning tales of frontier adventures. The Copper Canyon Chronicles, she murmured, the memories surfacing suddenly. He told them every year on my birthday, said they were special, just for me. Gabriel and Sullivan exchanged significant looks. That's what they're after, Sullivan confirmed. They believe those stories contain the location of the hidden documents. But they're just stories, Eleanor protested. Fanciful tales about a brave scout and a medicine man searching for a lost silver mine. Gabriel leaned forward, his expression intense. Are you certain? Think carefully, Eleanor. Did he ever mention specific landmarks, numbers that seemed out of place, phrases he repeated exactly the same way each time? The urgency in his voice made Eleanor pause, considering more carefully. There was a rhyme, she said slowly, something the medicine man would recite when they were searching for the mine. Father always said it exactly the same way, made me repeat it back to him. Both men tensed visibly. Can you recite it now? Gabriel asked. Eleanor closed her eyes, summoning the memory of her father's voice. 3 peaks stand guard where eagles nest, 40 paces north by northwest, where shadow falls at midday sun. What's lost awaits the chosen one. She opened her eyes. It's just a children's rhyme, or a set of coordinates, Sullivan muttered. Clever bastard. Gabriel rose from the table, pacing the small confines of the cabin. This changes things. If Prescott thinks you can lead him to those documents, he won't just come to claim you as property. He'll force the information from you, then make sure you can't testify about what you know. The implications hung heavy in the air. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. What can we do? We need to find those documents before Prescott does, Gabriel said firmly. They're our only leverage. And if we can't? Eleanor asked, voicing the question neither man seemed willing to acknowledge. Gabriel stopped pacing, his expression resolute. Then we make sure you're somewhere Prescott can never reach you. The Animas Canyon settlement, Sullivan suggested. Travis and his people would take her in. No questions asked. Gabriel nodded slowly. It's an option. But first, we try to solve Edward's puzzle. He turned to Eleanor. I need you to remember everything about those stories, every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. Eleanor hesitated, the enormity of the situation finally sinking in. This wasn't just about her freedom anymore. It was about justice for a massacre buried 20 years in the past, about her father's final effort to right a terrible wrong. I'll try, she promised, but the stories were long and complex. There were many versions, told over many years. Start with the most recent, Gabriel suggested. The last time he told you the Chronicles. Eleanor Eleanor closed her eyes again, concentrating. "It was different the last time," she said slowly. "It was just after Mother died. Father seemed urgent. He added a new chapter, one he'd never included before." "What was it about?" Sullivan pressed gently. "There's the scout and the medicine man finally found the silver mine," Eleanor recalled. "But when they entered, they discovered it wasn't silver at all, but books. Hundreds of books containing the true history of the frontier, written by witnesses who had been silenced." She opened her eyes, meeting Gabriel's intent gaze. "Father said that someday I might need to find the library myself, that the truth was the most valuable treasure of all." Gabriel's expression shifted from concentration to dawning realization. "The library," he murmured. "Edward, you clever man." He turned to Sullivan. "I know where it is." Sullivan straightened. "Where? Not where. What?" Gabriel's eyes held a newfound intensity. "Edward's medical volumes, the ones he sent me over the years. Special editions, he called them. Said they contained information not found in standard texts." Eleanor gasped softly. "The marginalia. Father always wrote notes in the margins of his books. Observations, corrections, cross-references." "Exactly." Gabriel moved to the bookshelf, pulling down several leather-bound medical texts. "These aren't just books. They're Edward's testimony, hidden in plain sight all these years." He opened one, flipping carefully through the pages. "Look here, what seems like medical notations, but the references don't match any medical text. They're coordinates, dates, names." Sullivan let out a low whistle. "Right under their noses all along, and they're hunting a ghost." Gabriel nodded grimly. "But they don't know that. Which means Prescott is still coming, and he still believes Eleanor holds the key." He closed the book with deliberate care. "We have maybe 2 days before they reach the pass. We need to be ready." "Ready how?" Eleanor asked, a new determination replacing her earlier fear. "Ooh, what's the plan?" Gabriel's expression hardened into something Eleanor hadn't seen before, the face of a man who had tracked fugitives across wilderness, who had survived prison and frontier justice. "We're going to use Prescott's obsession against him," he said, his voice cold and precise, "and we're going to finish what your father started." The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Gabriel's cabin, peaceful sanctuary that it had been, transformed into a fortress and command center. Sullivan rode out the first afternoon, ostensibly to hunt, but actually to set up observation points along the mountain passes that led to the valley. Gabriel, meanwhile, focused on reinforcing the cabin's defenses, checking sightlines, stockpiling ammunition, and preparing for various contingencies. Eleanor threw herself into the preparations with unexpected fervor. The revelations about her father's secret war against corruption had awakened something within her, a determination to see his final mission completed, to ensure that his sacrifices had not been in vain. Between defensive preparations, she pored over her father's medical texts with Gabriel, decoding the hidden messages embedded in the marginalia. "It's all here," she murmured on the evening of the second day, looking up from a particularly dense volume on frontier diseases. Names of officers who took bribes, locations of mass graves, testimony from survivors, all disguised as medical observations and case studies. Gabriel nodded, his expression grim as he cleaned his rifle by the fire. "Your father was thorough. This is enough to bring down half the territorial command structure and the entire board of Blackwell Mining. If we can get it to the right people," Eleanor added, the implicit challenge hanging in the air between them. "Sullivan has contacts in Denver," Gabriel replied. "Newspaper editors, federal marshals who aren't on Blackwell's payroll. If we can hold off Prescott long enough for Sullivan to get these books to Denver." He didn't finish the thought, but Eleanor understood. Everything hinged on their ability to withstand whatever force Prescott brought against them. She studied Gabriel's profile in the firelight. The stern lines of his face softened momentarily as he focused on his task. In just a few days, he had transformed in her eyes, from mysterious rescuer to complex ally to something she wasn't quite ready to name. "Gabriel," she said softly, using his given name with deliberate intent. "Tell me about the grave." His hands stilled on the rifle, but he didn't look up. For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer, might retreat behind the wall of privacy he maintained so carefully. But then, he set the weapon aside and met her gaze directly. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice low but steady. She came west after the war, looking for her brother who'd deserted, found me instead. Eleanor waited, sensing there was more to the story, unwilling to press but equally unwilling to retreat. She was unexpected, Gabriel continued after a pause. Smart, stubborn, had no business being out here, but wouldn't be told otherwise. A ghost of a smile touched his lips briefly. Reminded me of someone else I've met recently. Eleanor felt warmth rise in her cheeks, but remained silent, allowing him to continue at his own pace. We were married for less than a year before the fever took her, Gabriel said, his tone matter-of-fact, though Eleanor could sense the controlled pain beneath the words. Spring of '69. Nothing I could do but watch her slip away. He looked down at his hands, strong and capable, but ultimately powerless against some enemies. That's when your father came, too late to save her, but in time to help me bury her properly. I'm sorry, Eleanor said simply, understanding now why Gabriel had been so reluctant to speak of the cabin's previous occupant, why the grave bore no name. The pain of carving it would have been too great. Gabriel nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. After Sarah died, I considered leaving. These mountains held too many memories, but your father convinced me to stay, said Sarah would want me to make a life here, not just survive. He looked around the cabin. So I did. The confession hung in the air between them, an offering of trust that Eleanor recognized for the rare gift it was. Before she could respond, the cabin door opened, admitting a blast of cold air, and Sullivan, his face reddened from the mountain wind. They're here, he announced without preamble. Just reached the lower pass. 12 men, heavily armed, Prescott's leading them personally. Gabriel rose immediately, all vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of the seasoned fighter. How long? Dawn, if they push through the night, Sullivan replied, accepting the cup of coffee Eleanor hastily poured him. More likely mid-morning if they make camp. Gabriel nodded, mentally calculating. We need to move the horses to the upper meadow out of sight. They'll be watching for smoke, so no fire after midnight. He turned to Eleanor. And to pack only what's essential. Your father's books, warm clothing, food for 2 days. You're sending me away? She asked, a note of betrayal in her voice. No, Gabriel corrected firmly. I'm making sure you have what you need if we have to retreat quickly. Sullivan will take the most damning evidence to Denver at first light, but you and I will remain here to face Prescott. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. That's not the plan we discussed. Plans change, Gabriel replied, his tone brooking no argument. Prescott's obsession is with Eleanor. If she disappears, he'll never stop hunting her. We need to end this here. And how exactly do you propose to do that? Sullivan challenged. Even with the 3 of us, we're outnumbered 4-1. A dangerous smile ghosted across Gabriel's face. Numbers aren't everything in these mountains. We have position, knowledge of the terrain, and one thing Prescott doesn't expect. What's that? Eleanor asked. Gabriel's eyes met hers, and she was startled by the fierce pride she saw there. You, he said simply. Prescott thinks he's hunting a helpless Boston lady. He has no idea what Edward Blackwood's daughter is capable of. Despite the dire circumstances, Eleanor felt a surge of something like exhilaration. All her life, she had been defined by others, the doctor's dutiful daughter, the potential society wife, most recently the auction property to be claimed. For the first time, someone was seeing her not as an extension of others' expectations, but as herself, complex, capable, determined. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady and clear. The 3 of them worked through the night, preparing the cabin and surrounding area for what was to come. Sullivan departed before dawn, with half of the annotated medical texts secured in his saddlebags, taking a little-known trail that would bypass Prescott's men. His final words to Gabriel had been terse but laden with meaning. Don't die for Edward's cause, he had said, clasping Gabriel's hand firmly. He wouldn't want that. It's not just Edward's cause anymore, Gabriel had replied, his gaze shifting briefly to where Eleanor prepared supplies. Sullivan had followed his look and sighed. That's what worries me? Then, With a final nod to Eleanor, he had disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Now, as the sun crested the eastern peaks, Eleanor and Gabriel stood side by side on the cabin porch, watching the trail that wound up from the lower part. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that belied the violence that approached with each passing hour. "Are you afraid?" Gabriel asked quietly, not looking at her. Eleanor considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing, of letting my father down, of letting you down after all you've sacrificed." Gabriel turned to her then, his expression softening. "Eleanor," he said, her name a gentle rebuke, "you could never let me down. What I did at that auction block, it wasn't just about a promise to your father." The admission hung between them, fragile and momentous. Eleanor's heart quickened as Gabriel took a half-step closer, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "When I saw you standing there," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I saw someone whose spirit hadn't been broken despite everything that had been taken from her. Someone who faced the worst of humanity with dignity and courage." His hand rose hesitantly, then brushed a strand of hair from her face with surprising tenderness. "I would have spent my last dollar to save you, even if I'd never known your name, let alone your father." Eleanor's eyes widened at the confession. Before she could respond, a glint of metal on the distant trail caught her attention. Gabriel saw it too, his posture immediately shifting back to alertness. "They're here," he said, all vulnerability once again masked by purpose. "Are you ready?" Eleanor squared her shoulders, pushing away the swirling emotions his words had evoked. There would be time for those considerations later, if they survived the day. "I'm ready," she affirmed, and was surprised to discover it was true. Together, they watched as a line of riders emerged from the tree line at the valley's edge, sunlight gleaming off rifle barrels, and the distinctive figure of Joe Prescott leading the column. The distance was still too great to make out expressions, but the purposeful advance of the group left no doubt as to their intentions. "Remember the plan," Gabriel murmured, stepping back into the shadow of the porch. "Let them think they have the advantage. Everything depends on timing." Eleanor nodded, taking her position by the door as they had rehearsed. In her pocket, she felt the reassuring weight of her father's pocket watch, the only personal possession she had managed to keep through her ordeal. Its steady ticking seemed to echo her heartbeat as she prepared to face the man who had tried to purchase her like livestock, who had pursued her across mountains to silence a truth buried for 20 years. The final confrontation was about to begin. Prescott's men approached with the confidence of predators who believed their prey was cornered. They spread out in a loose semicircle before the cabin, rifles ready, but not yet raised. Joe Prescott himself rode slightly ahead of the others, his expensive coat and polished boots incongruous against the rugged mountain backdrop. Eleanor watched through a gap in the curtains as instructed, counting men and noting positions while remaining out of sight. Gabriel stood on the porch, seemingly alone and unconcerned, his rifle propped casually against the railing rather than in his hands. It was a calculated risk, appearing unthreatening while ensuring he could reach his weapon in an instant if needed. "Hayes," Prescott called, reining his horse to a stop about 30 yards from the cabin. "Quite the remote location you've chosen. Difficult to find." "That's the idea," Gabriel replied evenly. "Not fond of unexpected visitors." Prescott's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "And yet you have one. A female visitor, I believe. Purchased rather recently in Thornfield." Gabriel didn't blink. "My business is my own, Prescott." "Not in this case." Prescott dismounted smoothly, handing his reins to one of his men. "You see, there's been a misunderstanding. The woman you bought, she wasn't actually for sale." "Strange," Gabriel countered. "The sheriff and auctioneer seemed to think otherwise. As did you, judging by your enthusiastic bidding." A flash of anger crossed Prescott's face before he mastered it. "A regrettable charade necessary to recover stolen property." He took a step forward, his voice hardening. "The woman belongs to Blackwell Mining Company. She has information that belongs to us." "Information?" Gabriel raised an eyebrow, the picture of confused innocence. "She's a Boston doctor's daughter, not a company clerk." "Don't play ignorant, Hayes." It doesn't suit you." Prescott's facade of civility was slipping. Edward Blackwood stole documents that could ruin good men, patriotic men who helped tame this savage country. His daughter is the key to finding them. Gabriel leaned against the porch post. His posture relaxed, though Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Sounds like quite a story, but I'm afraid I can't help you. The lady isn't here." Prescott's laugh was harsh. "You expect me to believe you left her somewhere, after spending every cent you had to buy her? Believe what you want." Gabriel shrugged. "But I escorted her to Denver 2 days ago. She's under the protection of the federal marshal there now, along with whatever information she might possess." Eleanor held her breath, watching Prescott's reaction through the window. This was the gamble, convincing Prescott she was gone while keeping him talking long enough for the next phase of their plan. Prescott's eyes narrowed as he studied Gabriel. "Search the cabin," he ordered without looking back at his men. "Every room, every corner." 2 men dismounted immediately, moving toward the porch with rifles raised. Gabriel didn't move, didn't reach for his weapon, though Eleanor could see his muscles coil in readiness. "I wouldn't," he said quietly. "This is private property. You have no authority here." "Authority?" Prescott laughed again. "Look around you, Hayes. I have 12 armed men. That's all the authority I need in these mountains." The men had reached the porch steps when Gabriel spoke again, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. 13. Prescott frowned. "What? You said 12 men?" Gabriel clarified. "But I count 13 riders." A ripple of confusion passed through Prescott's group as men turned to count their own numbers. It was the moment Eleanor had been waiting for. Silently, she slipped out the back door as they had planned, circling to the position they had prepared the night before. Meanwhile, Gabriel continued his deliberate distraction. "Interesting that you'd miscalculate something so basic, Prescott. Makes me wonder what else you've gotten wrong." Prescott's face flushed with anger. "Enough game. Search the cabin." Now, the 2 men resumed their approach, but Gabriel made no move to stop them. Eleanor, now hidden among the rocks on the ridge above the cabin, withdrew her father's pocket watch and checked the time. 3 minutes until the signal. Inside the cabin, the searchers found nothing but empty rooms and ordinary furnishings. When they emerged onto the porch, their expressions confirmed what Gabriel had claimed. "She's not here, sir," one reported. Prescott's composure cracked further. "That's impossible. Where are her things? There must be some sign of her." "Nothing, sir. Place looks like only he's been living here." Gabriel allowed himself a small smile. "As I said, she's in Denver. Now, if you've satisfied your curiosity, I'd appreciate it if you and your men would leave my property." "You're lying." Prescott's hand moved to his sidearm. "She's here somewhere, and you're going to tell me where or what?" Gabriel's voice remained calm, though his body tensed imperceptibly. "You'll shoot an unarmed man in cold blood. Even in these mountains, that's still murder." The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the clear mountain air. Eleanor checked her watch again. 1 minute remaining. She reached for the rifle hidden among the rocks, ensuring it was loaded and ready. Prescott finally broke the silence. "I don't need to shoot you, Hayes. Not right away." He nodded to his men. "Burn it. Burn everything. We'll see how cooperative he becomes when his little kingdom is ashes." Several men dismounted, retrieving torches from their saddlebags. They had come prepared for destruction. Gabriel's expression hardened, but he still made no move toward his rifle. "Last chance, Prescott," he warned. "Leave now, and we can all pretend this never happened." Prescott laughed. "You're in no position to offer chances, Hayes. Where is the Blackwood woman? Where are the documents?" The second hand on Eleanor's watch completed its circuit. It was time. A single shot rang out from the ridge, the bullet striking the ground at Prescott's feet with deliberate precision. The men froze, heads swiveling to locate the shooter. "No, that," Gabriel said calmly, "was your only warning shot." Eleanor shifted position slightly, keeping her rifle trained on the group below. According to their plan, she would remain hidden, providing covering fire if needed, while Gabriel handled the confrontation. The fact that Prescott's men now knew there was a second defender, but couldn't see where, changed the dynamics considerably. "You're outgunned, Hayes," Prescott snarled, though his eyes darted nervously toward the ridge. "One extra rifle doesn't change that." "Perhaps," Gabriel conceded, "but consider this. Your men are bunched together in the open. My partner has the high ground and clear sightlines. How many of you will fall before you reach me? 3, 5 more. He stepped forward, finally reaching for his rifle with unhurried confidence. "Oh, are you willing to die for Blackwell Mining, Prescott? Are your men?" Uncertainty rippled through the group. Several of the hired guns exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. "He's bluffing," Prescott insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Test me," Gabriel invited softly. "You came hunting a woman you think knows where some old papers are hidden. Are those papers worth dying for?" Before Prescott could respond, a new sound echoed through the valley, hoofbeats, many of them approaching from the western pass. All heads turned as a line of riders emerged from the trees, moving at a controlled canter toward the cabin. Sullivan had returned, and he wasn't alone. Beside him rode half a dozen men in the distinctive attire of the Animas Canyon settlement, hardened mountain folk who lived by their own code and owed allegiance to no company or government. "Seems the odds just changed," Gabriel observed mildly. Prescott's face contorted with rage. "You think this changes anything? Blackwell has judges, governors in its pocket. These mountain rats can't protect you." "Perhaps not," came a new voice, clear and unwavering. Eleanor emerged from her hiding place, rifle still trained on Prescott as she made her way carefully down to stand beside Gabriel. "But these might." From inside her coat, she withdrew several folded papers, copies of the most damning pages from her father's journals that they had prepared the previous night. "These are copies," she announced, loud enough for all to hear. "The originals are already on their way to newspapers in Denver, St. Louis, and Chicago, along with the territorial governor and 3 federal judges not on Blackwell's payroll." Prescott's face drained of color. "You're bluffing." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "My father documented everything, Mr. Prescott. The massacre at Copper Creek, the bribes to Colonel Hargrove, the forged treaties, the mass graves." She held up one paper. "Including your role in silencing witnesses." "You can't prove any of that," Prescott hissed, but his eyes fixed on the papers with naked fear. "These are just insurance," Eleanor continued as Sullivan and his companions arrived, forming a protective semicircle behind her and Gabriel. "By this time tomorrow, my father's evidence will be public knowledge. Blackwell Mining will be finished, and so will everyone who participated in the cover-up." For a moment, no one moved. The tableau held Prescott and his increasingly uncertain men facing Gabriel, Eleanor, and their unexpected reinforcements. Then, slowly, one of Prescott's hired guns lowered his rifle. "I didn't sign on for this," he announced, turning to Prescott. "You said we were recovering stolen property, not covering up massacres." "Shut up," Prescott snapped, but it was too late. The fragile cohesion of his force was unraveling as more men exchanged uncertain glances. "It's over, Prescott," Gabriel said quietly. "Leave now, and you might reach the territorial border before the warrants are issued." Prescott's hand hovered near his sidearm, his face a mask of thwarted rage and desperation. For a heartbeat, Eleanor thought he might draw despite the overwhelming odds against him. Then, with a curse, he turned and strode back to his horse. "This isn't finished," he spat as he mounted. "Yes," Eleanor replied with quiet certainty. "It is." One by one, Prescott's men followed him, some looking relieved to retreat without bloodshed, others simply calculating enough to recognize a lost cause. Only when the last rider disappeared down the trail did Eleanor allow her shoulders to relax, the rifle lowering to her side. "You did well," Gabriel murmured, his hand coming to rest briefly on her shoulder. "We all did," she corrected, turning to include Sullivan and the newcomers in her gaze. "Thank you for coming back," Sullivan grinned, dismounting with a wince. "Couldn't let you have all the fun. Besides, Travis here owed me a favor." He nodded toward a grizzled man with a silver-streaked beard who seemed to be the leader of the settlement group. "Any enemy of Blackwell Mining is a friend of ours," Travis said simply. Sullivan explained enough. "We're happy to help." Eleanor looked around at these men, strangers who had ridden into potential danger on nothing more than Sullivan's word and a shared hatred of corporate tyranny. "I don't know how to thank you all." "No need for thanks," Travis replied. "Your father's evidence might finally bring justice for a lot of people who've suffered under Blackwell's boot." "That's payment enough. As the adrenaline of confrontation faded, exhaustion swept over Eleanor. Gabriel must have noticed, for he gently took the rifle from her trembling hands. "It's over," he said softly, for her ears alone. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the reassurance, both knew it wasn't entirely true. Prescott might have retreated, but the battle to bring Blackwell Mining to justice was just beginning. The evidence was on its way to Denver, but powerful men would fight to discredit it, to bury the truth once again. Their victory was real but fragile, a momentary reprieve rather than a final resolution. And in that moment of uncertain triumph, Eleanor realized something else. She had no idea what came next. For the first time since her father's death, her path forward was entirely her own to determine. The afternoon following Prescott's retreat brought a quiet celebration to Gabriel's cabin. Travis and his men had departed after sharing a meal, promising to maintain patrols in the area until word came from Denver about the reception of the evidence. Sullivan remained, his normally sardonic demeanor softened by genuine relief at their narrow escape from bloodshed. As dusk settled over the valley, Eleanor found herself on the western porch, watching the sun sink behind the jagged peaks. The day's events played through her mind in vivid detail. The confrontation, the gamble, the unexpected reinforcements. She had stood her ground against the man who had tried to purchase her, had helped foil a conspiracy that had claimed countless lives. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something like peace settling over her. Footsteps on the porch announced Gabriel's approach. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, offering one to her without a word. They stood in companionable silence, watching the brilliant colors of sunset paint the mountainsides. Sullivan received word from his contact in Denver," Gabriel finally said, his voice low. "The federal marshal has the documents, several newspaper editors as well." Eleanor nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders. "Then it's really over. My father's evidence will finally be heard. Justice moves slowly," Gabriel cautioned, "especially when powerful interests are threatened. But yes, the truth is out now. It can't be buried again." Eleanor sipped her coffee, considering his words. What will happen to Prescott? If he's smart, he's halfway to Mexico by now, Gabriel replied. If not, he shrugged. Men like that rarely face proper justice, but his usefulness to Blackwell has ended. They'll cut him loose to save themselves. And Blackwell Mining, they'll fight, deny, try to discredit the evidence. But corporations can withstand what individual men cannot. They might survive in some form, though diminished. Gabriel's expression hardened briefly. But the army officers involved, the ones still living, they'll face courts-martial. At the very least, Eleanor nodded, satisfaction warming her more than the coffee. My father would be pleased. He never sought vengeance, only accountability. Edward was a good man, Gabriel agreed quietly. One of the few I've known who lived by his principles regardless of the cost. The mention of cost brought Eleanor's thoughts back to the auction block, to Gabriel's last dollar spent to save her. She turned to face him directly. What happens now? She asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate future. Gabriel met her gaze, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Well, that depends on what you want, Eleanor. What I want, she repeated softly. Never in her life had anyone asked her that question with such sincerity, such openness to whatever answer she might give. In Boston, her path had been predetermined: a suitable marriage, a respectable household, a life confined by societal expectations. Her father's death and the subsequent betrayal had shattered that future, casting her adrift. But now, standing beside this quiet mountain man who had risked everything for her, new possibilities stretched before her like the vast western horizon. I want justice for my father, she began slowly, organizing her thoughts. I want to see his work completed, his evidence presented properly. Gabriel nodded, unsurprised. That means going to Denver, possibly testifying before a federal judge. Yes, Eleanor took a deep breath. But after that, I'm not certain. Boston holds nothing for me now. My father's house is gone, his practice sold to cover the fabricated debts. You could start over, Gabriel suggested. Denver is growing. A woman of your education and determination could build a new life there. The offer was generous, a graceful way to release him from any further obligation toward her. Eleanor studied his face, searching for what remained unspoken. Is that what you think I should do?" she asked carefully. Gabriel set his mug down on the porch railing, his movements deliberate. "What I think doesn't matter. This is your decision, Eleanor, your life. It matters to me," she countered. "Your opinion matters." He turned to face the darkening valley, his profile strong against the last light of day. "I've lived alone for a long time," he said finally. "After Sarah died, I never expected to share this place again. Never wanted to." He paused, choosing his words with care. "These past days have reminded me of what it means to have purpose beyond survival, to fight for something worthwhile." Eleanor waited, sensing he wasn't finished. "If you choose Denver or Boston or anywhere else, I'll respect that choice," he continued. "I'll help you get wherever you want to go." "But he turned back to her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "If you wanted to stay, even for a while, I'd welcome your company." The simple offer, delivered without pressure or expectation, touched Eleanor deeply. This was no passionate declaration of love, no dramatic plea, just an honest invitation to share a life, however temporarily, on equal terms. "These mountains are beautiful," she said softly. "Harsh, but beautiful. I can see why you've made your home here." "They're not for everyone," Gabriel acknowledged. "Winters long and hard, springs brief, comforts a few. But there's freedom," Eleanor finished for him. "Freedom and peace." Gabriel nodded, a smile touching his lips. "Yeah." Eleanor thought of her father's stories, the Copper Canyon chronicles he had told her throughout her childhood. Those tales had always featured the brave scout, finding not just justice, but eventually peace in the mountains. She had assumed they were merely fanciful endings to entertain a child. Now she wondered if they had been her father's wish for his friend, for the man who stood before her now. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to see the seasons change in these mountains, to experience winter's challenge and spring's renewal." She met his gaze directly. "If your invitation remains open." The relief and quiet joy that transformed Gabriel's expression confirmed what Eleanor had begun to suspect, that his offer had cost him dearly in vulnerability, that he had prepared himself for rejection. "It remains open," he said simply, "and for as long as you wish." Inside the cabin, Sullivan's voice called them to dinner, breaking the moment but not the understanding that had formed between them. As they turned to go in, Gabriel's hand brushed hers, not quite taking it, but an acknowledgement of possibility. 3 months later, snow blanketed the valley in pristine white, transforming Gabriel's homestead into a scene from a fairy tale. The cabin, its windows glowing with warm lamplight against the early evening darkness, had changed in subtle ways. New curtains, crafted from fabric brought back from a trip to the nearest town. Shelves reorganized to accommodate Eleanor's growing collection of botanical specimens. A second rocking chair beside the first on the covered porch. Inside, Eleanor added the final touches to a letter addressed to Sullivan in Denver. Their friend had become their most reliable link to the outside world, bringing supplies, mail, and news of the ongoing legal proceedings against Blackwell Mining and the implicated army officers. The latest developments were promising. Indictments had been issued, trials scheduled for spring. "Finished?" Gabriel asked, looking up from the book he was reading by the fire. In the months since her decision to stay, he had gradually relaxed the vigilant guardedness that had defined him for so long. He smiled more easily now, laughed occasionally, small changes that nonetheless transformed him. "Almost," Eleanor replied, signing her name with a flourish. "Just adding news about the new medicinal properties I've discovered in that alpine moss. I think it might interest some of Father's former colleagues." Gabriel nodded approvingly. Her informal studies of mountain flora had evolved from hobby to serious research over the winter months. "Sullivan says one of the Denver doctors is eager to correspond with you about it." "Yes, Dr. Winters." Eleanor sealed the envelope, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "I've been thinking, when spring comes, perhaps we might consider a trip to Denver. I could meet with Dr. Winters in person and testify if needed." Gabriel finished for her. "I've been thinking the same." Eleanor rose from the writing desk and moved to join him by the fire. "It won't be easy, facing those men in court." "No," he agreed, But you won't face them alone. The simple promise warmed her more than the crackling fire. Over the months of shared meals, conversations, and quiet evening, their relationship had evolved with the careful patience that seemed to define everything Gabriel did. There had been no grand declarations, no dramatic moments, just a gradual, deepening connection built on mutual respect and growing affection. Eleanor settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "And I found something today while organizing Father's old letters." She withdrew a folded paper from her pocket. "I think you should see it." Gabriel took the letter curiously. As he read, his expression softened. "I never knew he wrote this," he said finally, his voice slightly hoarse. The letter, dated just weeks before Edward Blackwood's death, was addressed to Eleanor. In it, her father had written of his premonition that he might not live much longer, and of his wish that she might someday meet the man who had taught him the true meaning of courage and integrity, Gabriel Hayes. "If Providence ever brings you together," Edward had written, "know that I would trust him with my life, and more importantly, with yours. In these uncertain times, such men are rare beyond measure." Gabriel carefully refolded the letter. "He never sent it." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But somehow, his wish was granted anyway. Providence, or perhaps just Prescott's greed, brought us together after all." Gabriel took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I spent my last dollar to save you," he said quietly. "Best investment I ever made." Eleanor smiled, leaning against his shoulder as the winter wind whistled outside their sanctuary. She'd been sold to the highest bidder, her freedom purchased for $137.83. But what she had found in these mountains, purpose, justice, companionship, and perhaps something more, was beyond any price. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the small grave that Eleanor had helped Gabriel mark properly with a carved headstone. Sarah's memory was honored now, not hidden, just as Eleanor's father's legacy had finally found its voice. The past was not forgotten, but neither did it overshadow the future that stretched before them, a future they would face together when the snow melted and spring returned to the mountains. For now, though, they had this moment, firelight and companionable silence, hard-won peace in a cabin far from the world's demands. Eleanor had come to understand that sometimes salvation came in unexpected form. A quiet mountain man giving his last dollar on an auction block, a doctor embedding truth in medical texts, a daughter finding strength she never knew she possessed. "Spring will be here before we know it," Gabriel murmured, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. Eleanor nodded, content in the knowledge that whatever challenges awaited beyond the snow-covered passes, they would face them as they had faced Prescott, together, standing their ground, their shared strength greater than the sum of its parts. "Yes," she agreed softly, "spring always comes."